let me ask sort of a critical question of, if you're wrong about your statements about Bitcoin, you find out years from now that you were wrong, what would that look like? What would be the things that make you realize you were wrong? Likely ideas or crazy out there ideas? Do you think about this kind of stuff?
All the time.
Because you speak very confidently about Bitcoin. And one of the things, let me put it this way, I think certainty, I feel like that's like a stoic statement. Certainty leads to ruin, something like that. Like certainty, I think, is an antithesis to progress often. And especially in your writing, but this is true for the Bitcoin community, there's a certainty about the Bitcoin. And that makes me very skeptical, no matter how good the ideas are. Whenever things are good, this might be the Russian in me. I think like, what are the ways this is going to go wrong? So what do you think are the ways this might go wrong, or you're wrong in your conception of what Bitcoin is?
Yeah, so science evolves via negativa, meaning that we're not proving hypotheses, and that's what becomes the body of science. Science is whatever is left over as we disprove hypotheses, right? Whatever we can empirically, through experimentation, disprove gets discarded, and whatever remains, whatever theory remains that hasn't been disproven, is science, effectively. This process is similar to market actors zeroing in on a store value, right? They're experimenting with different forms of storing wealth across time. Some do better than others, and eventually everyone ends up on the one that is best. That's what gold was. In terms of understanding Bitcoin, I look at it as a similar approach. And that is the main question I'm asking myself is, how do you stop this thing? How do you turn it off? How do you end it? If you're a nation state, particularly, who has the most to lose in this transition, what is the attack vector by which they neutralize Bitcoin? I mean, that is the $250 trillion question.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've spent 5 years thinking about this thing very deeply. I've read everything on monetary history I can get my hands on. The general thought of how it is stopped, and this is the snag point that a lot of people get to in their explorations down the rabbit hole, is they just say the government will never allow it, and that becomes kind of their bottom. It's like, all right, Bitcoin's interesting, it's superior money, blah blah blah, but the government will never allow it. And they say,
Was Ray Dalio, did he say that
Dalio is
recently?
currently stuck there. Yeah.
So Ray Dalio said that Bitcoin seems to be too promising.
Yeah.
If it is in fact as promising as it looks, governments are going to, I don't forget what the exact quote is, but not allow it. Ban it.
Yeah.
Governments will ban it. So how do you get Ray Dalio unstuck from your perspective?
Well,
And how do you get unstuck from that idea that how do you prevent governments from stopping a thing that threatens centralized power?
Well, Bitcoin is an idea. So governments that are really good at fighting centralized threats to their power, right? Whether that's a currency counterfeiter or a competing nation state or a business they don't like or an individual they don't like, they can kill them, they can throw them in jail, they can use any number of coercive or violent tactics to suppress it. But how do you point a gun at an idea? How do you coerce an idea? And that's, there is some anecdotal history here where there's the PGP case, which in the United States, the court was trying to classify it as munitions when we were shipping this pretty good privacy software overseas. Government wanted to classify it as munitions and restrict that exportation. And this was a circuit court case precedent when the PGP attorneys actually printed out the source code on paper and presented it as evidence in the court. All of a sudden it became protected under freedom of speech, and that it's just code is speech, code is language, and therefore, at least in the United States, it's protected under the First Amendment. I think a government ban would be largely unenforceable, frankly, on Bitcoin. Being that it's pure information, if you suppress market actors from using it in one jurisdiction, you're just creating incentives for them to go elsewhere. And you're actually increasing the incentives for other jurisdictions to be favorable towards it, because then they get to benefit from the tax revenue and the businesses and the innovation that's occurring in and around Bitcoin as a result.
So you don't think if a particular central bank, like in Europe or United States, bans it, not maybe using those terms, but in some kind of way, you think that provides a really strong incentive for the other big players to enable it?
That's right. And they're more likely, by the way, and governments know this, by the way, too. The other thing that causes a government to shoot itself in the foot is that if they ban something, they draw a lot of attention to it.
Yeah.
People are smart. I mean, people ask why. Why would a government ban it? Why can't I use this? So that's kind of typically be the last arrow in their quiver. They may try to ban it if Bitcoin, really starts to monetize very quickly, and the power structures that they impose today start to dissolve faster than others might think they will. Then they might try and ban it, but I think that ban will be largely unenforceable. They're more likely to tax it, which they already do tax it. They're likely to increase taxation of it. They're likely to try and make it more white market by actually tracing Bitcoin, seeing who has it, attaching identities to Bitcoin ownership, and making sure that they're getting their pound of flesh on all the transactions it results in. But I don't think, the other thing about this is, so we saw the internet outcompete intranets. In that we could say that open source networks tend to outcompete closed source networks. And there's a really good reason for this. And it's because in a closed source network, there are costs associated with defending the network itself. So the network owners, the owners of the closed source network, have to expend resources protecting it from competitors, and they have to expend resources imposing its rules, because they're not voluntarily adopted rules. So you actually have to impose these rule sets. Whereas an open source network, which is something much more akin to capitalism, pure in its pure sense, these are voluntarily adopted rules. So all market participants have agreed and consented to this rule set. So there's no enforcement cost and there's no turf protection, because anyone can freely enter or exit the open network. For that energetic reason, I think open networks outcompete closed networks typically. And in the digital age, that's why I think that's why internet outcompetes intranet, and that's why open source networks are going to eat closed source networks. So what Bitcoin would be in that lens is the ultimate open source monetary network devouring closed source central bank monetary networks. And I just don't see how there's no possibility of unilaterally stopping Bitcoin or destroying it. So then they're more likely to regulate or tax it. And again, the other fallacy here is that a lot of people tend to think of governments as these singular, indivisible entities, like they just move under one plan. But in reality, it's a lot of people, right? A lot of people with loosely coupled interests and agendas and whatnot. Regulators and others, wearing their citizen hat, they're going to see this thing monetizing. They're going to be on the front lines of trying to regulate it, trying to control it. And I think what's likely to happen is they're going to start to adopt it, to buy some of it, even as an individual, or possibly even ultimately at a central bank or sovereign wealth fund level, as an insurance policy against its success. And once you start to acquire something and then you have a vested economic interest in its monetization, I think it kind of dissolves any of the power structures that are arrayed against it from the inside. So I've written a lot about this in a new series called Sovereignism, which is based loosely on a book called The Sovereign Individual. And that's the general thesis, is that microprocessing technology would devour our organizational models, the most important of which is the nation state. So I think we're going into this world where coercion and violence is just much less rewarding. You can't. The economics of violence are declining because of the low cost of protecting property. Right, you can now protect your monetary property in Bitcoin at orders of magnitude less cost than is necessary to run a banking network. So it changes the way we organize ourselves. And again, if we zooming back to gold as kind of the original governor to governments, where if they manipulated the money, gold would leave their country. Mm-hmm. That's why governments have taken relatively concerted action to go off of the gold standard. There's a great book on this called The Gold Wars that outlines how governments have been waging a cold war against gold for the past 50 years. Bitcoin sort of renews hope for that free market governor of governments, and that is this digital gold that governments cannot stop or co-opt. So I think it's something, that's why I think it's such a big deal, is that it is changing. It's a new useful fiction, you might say, a useful fiction that's superordinate to the mythology of the nation state and government as the dominant institution in the world.
Well, I hope you're right that all forms of centralized power start breaking apart naturally. So governments, the more and more power is given to the individual, whatever the technology is. And Bitcoin seems to be a promising technology that empowers that, enables that. Mm-hmm. That seems to be the trend. And that's a promising trend from at least from a perspective of somebody who values this particular biological meat bag that's full of consciousness.
I think Bitcoin is exposing the greatest scam in human history, which is political authority. Like, who gives anyone the right to have political authority over anyone else? People should be free to adopt the rules and systems and tools that best suit their needs. And that arc of history we covered earlier, where as socioeconomic systems have become more favorable towards individual sovereignty, the more wealthy we have become. The more we have given the individual, we've maximized individual choice, the more wealth that society has created, and the more it has outcompeted the systems that have come before it. The latest would be, capitalism triumphing over socialism.